Growing up, my mother, Evelyn, absolutely detested me. I was an only child, and it was made very clear that I was, as she put it, the worst mistake she had ever made. I know the circumstances of my birth by heart, as she practically branded the words into my brain. My mother was 19, beautiful and free, brilliant, she told me, and a beauty pageant starlet. She had just won Miss Bricktown and was on her way to becoming Miss Oklahoma. That was, of course, until she fell ill. By falling ill, she meant she was pregnant with me. She told me I ruined her. I stole her from the spotlight. I sucked the life out of her with everything it took to birth and raise me. What she won't tell you is that she didn't just fall ill. She fell right into a male judge who promised her a shining crown. If you ask her, though, she'll never admit it. Hell, in her eyes, I might as well have been some twisted, immaculate conception. From this, you can guess just how horrible my childhood was. She spit venom every time she spoke to me, and though she never hit me, she knew how to instill a deeper, more personal pain. I did whatever I could to try and impress her. Clubs, sports, I was even student body president, but nothing worked. She detested me and viewed me only as a thing that ruined her life. The final straw was when I turned 16. At this age, I had finally well matured and began to take after my mother's looks. She must have noticed, because one day after school I came home to a large, frilly pink dress sitting on my bed. She had signed me up for some beauty pageant 2 towns over. This is when I finally had enough. I was not going to let her ignore and berate me my whole life and then suddenly try and live vicariously through me. Absolutely not. I emancipated, cut off all contact, and began living with a friend of mine. I graduated, went to college, got married. I have a lovely life that never existed under her roof. Now, I am 26 and just have my first child, a baby girl I named Lydia. Last night, the message came in from a number I didn't recognize. Adriana, it's Evelyn. You should be receiving my package any day now. I stared at my phone, dumbfounded. I had changed my number several times in the last 10 years and had no living relatives anymore to give her my new one. I collected myself and replied, "Who is this actually? Is this some kind of sick joke?" The next text came in quickly. "I see you've never lost your attitude, did you? I will be visiting soon to meet my sweet granddaughter. XOXO, Mimi." I knew it wasn't true. She didn't even know what state I lived in, let alone my address. I didn't know who was pulling such a sick prank on me, but I blocked the number promptly. In the next couple days, I quickly forgot about the exchange. The number was blocked and that was it. That was until I opened my door one evening and found a small lavender box on my front porch. On top of the box was a glittery bow with a note tied to it reading, "To Lydia, love Mimi." No shipping label, no return address, just those 4 horrifying words. With shaking hands, I brought the box inside and untied the ribbons, keeping it together. Inside was a bright pink, frilly dress, the same one my mother bought for me when I was 16. Only this one was small enough to fit a very young child in. My hand shut over my mouth in horror. Whoever was pulling this twisted little stunt had taken it too far. This was sick. I grabbed my phone and dialed my husband as quickly as I could. The call failed immediately. He had gone on some stupid bachelor party ski trip and, just my luck, had no service. No, my husband wasn't enough. I went to dial 911 before the next text came in from another unrecognized number. "A lovely dress for the future starlet. It's important to start training them early. I'll be there shortly to help out. XOXO, Mimi." "Listen here, you sick freak," I typed vigorously. "I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, but you better leave my family alone before I get the cops involved." I blocked the number again. I felt exhausted and sick. I hoped that the threat of police would be enough for this to stop. I grabbed Lydia from her playpen and held her in my arms tight before hauling the 2 of us into my bed and going to sleep. I decided that my little girl was not leaving my sight until this whole thing blew over. I'll admit, even if I did think it was a joke, I was getting uneasy. That unease grew into genuine fear the following morning. I awoke to my daughter crying, burrowed in my chest. I pried open my sleep-crusted eyes and immediately did a double take. Perched on top of my baby's head was a small, silver tiara. I could feel acid rising in my throat at the sight. I knew it wasn't ours, as I refused to get my daughter anything even slightly related to pageantry due to the trauma of my youth. I jumped out of bed and practically sprinted to my front door. It was wide open. Someone had been in my home. The only people who knew the keypad lock code were my husband and I. How had someone been in my home? I called the police. They showed up and inspected my home. All that they could tell me was that if nothing was stolen, then I should get security cameras and install new locks. Pissed was an understatement, but I did as they instructed. The new lock would be here the day after tomorrow, and the cameras would be here next week. This was too long for comfort. Things were clearly escalating, and I didn't know if I even had until the day after tomorrow. What that even meant, I hardly knew. I was in a panicked frenzy. I had barely hit submit order when the next message came in, again, from a new unknown number. You are being very rude, Adie. I will see my grandbaby whether you like it or not, and I will be damned if I let some silly lock keep me out. This is my right. You may have ruined me, but I will not let you ruin that little girl too. This time I fully threw up. Adie. It was a name only my mother called me as a child. I had never used it with anyone else. No one else could have known this sick little pet name. This no longer felt like a trick. The truth boiled up like last night's dinner. This was her. My mother had found me after all these years. Through welling tears, I replied, I don't know how you found me, and I don't care. This is my family, not yours. If you come anywhere near my daughter again, I swear to God, I will kill you. The next text came in only moments later. You can try. I will see you this evening for dinner. XOXO. Mimi. I spent the rest of the day in a panic. I barricaded every door and window into my house. I was taking absolutely no chances. What the hell was I so scared of? At this point, she must have been 45. Surely I would be able to overpower her if it came to that, right? I put my daughter down to bed at 7:30. After triple checking that there was no way in or out of this house, I sat in my kitchen, a knife clutched in my hand, watching the front lawn. As expected, another text came in. This text was a single image, an image of my home. An image of me in the window, eyes filled with fear. Another message came in that simply read, I'm here. My animal instincts kicked in. If she was here, I was going to face her. By God, I was absolutely not going to be afraid of this woman. I would not allow her any more control over my life. I was going to end this. I pulled the armchair out from in front of the door, tearing apart my barricade I had been so worried about before, and stormed into my front lawn, knife still in hand. That's when I saw her. She was standing unmoving, unblinking in my neighbor's front lawn, directly across the street, wearing my pink frilly dress and an impossibly tall silver crown. As I walked closer, I began to realize something was horribly wrong with her. The dress she was wearing looked torn to shreds. It was covered in deep brown stains, and I swear I could smell it from where I stood. Not only that, but she was completely deformed. Her once long blonde curly hair was now matted and gray. It looked as though it had begun falling out of her head in clumps, leaving large bald patches. She was impossibly thin, her now pale yellow-tinged skin stretched paper thin over sharp bone. There were green, pus-filled pockets along her arms and legs that looked almost like mold. Then her face, oh dear God, her face! It was like something from a horror movie. Her lips seemed to have receded, showing thick black gums and yellow cracked teeth. The lack of lip did not stop her from painting a cherry red ring around her perpetual smile. Her eyes seemed to have shrunk back into their sockets. Smoky eye makeup made them look like deeply bruised pits. She raised a single rotting hand and gave me a beauty queen wave, turning her wrist back and forth. I let out a blood-curdling scream before quickly turning around and bolting back inside. I slammed the door behind me, returned the armchair into its defensive position, and ran to my kitchen window, but she was gone. I thought of calling the police, but they had been useless already. No, this was my fight, and something inside of me knew it. But oh God, what was wrong with her? For the first time in my life, I decided to look my mother up on the internet. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I had to know what was happening. I couldn't just wait here like a sitting duck for that monster to come back. I typed her name into the search bar. The first few articles were all old, simple retellings of her pageant winnings and interviews from 10 years ago. Then I saw an article from this year, 2 months ago to be exact. It was a scanned image of a newspaper article, far smaller and less extravagant than the others, from her youth, crammed into the bottom of the page. The article detailed a couple who was taking a morning walk when they stumbled upon an unmoving body. I'll give you 2 guesses as to who it was, but I'll bet you only need one. She had overdosed. She was a crackhead. My mother. My perfect, ever-bragging mother. A crackhead. More importantly than that, she was dead. Only she wasn't dead. She was outside. I just saw her living and breathing. I tried to rationalize, only to realize that that thing I saw outside could not have been living and breathing. My breath shortened. My stomach emptied onto the kitchen floor once again. My heart began to beat out of its chest when the last message came in. I'm coming in now. I am going to see my grandbaby. XOXO. Mimi. I'm sitting here now in my daughter's room trying not to wake her. I can feel the tears streaking down my face. This last message came in 5 minutes ago and the knocking started 2 minutes ago. I can't move. I'm frozen with fear. My poor baby is sleeping soundly behind me with no clue as to what horrors are happening around her. I don't know what to do. My mother's knocks have finally ceased. I can hear her punching the keypad. It's too late. That thing is here. She found me. I still have my knife. I hope to God that I have the strength to use it. Lydia, if by some miracle you find this someday, please know that I love you and that I plan to go out fighting to protect you. I am so sorry. Before I begin, let me say I love my wife very much, and still do. When I said for better or for worse, I meant it. I don't love what she has become is the problem. The only reason I'm even typing this out is to get it off my chest to someone. My wife and I had been trying to have a baby for a little over a year now, but hadn't succeeded until I bought some takeout at this new restaurant near our home. Molly had miscarried the previous week and was sulking around in a depressive state ever since. She hadn't been eating very much and had quarantined herself into our dark bedroom to grieve over our latest loss. I know Chinese food is her favorite, and it might be the only way to get a full meal in her. It was a nice evening overall. We watched a comedy on TV. Molly gratefully gobbled down the orange chicken with fried rice, and afterwards, we cracked open our fortune cookies. Mine said something about working hard. I didn't really care, but I remember hers clear as day. Now is the time, it read in tiny black letters. In that moment, she pounced on me. We made love most of the night, and a few weeks later, my wife was pregnant again. Once she made it past the 2-month mark, we were comfortable enough to tell our family and friends without fear of another miscarriage. I felt like all of our troubles were behind us and looked forward to starting our perfect family together. Little did I know, that was far from the end of our problems. The pregnancy so far has been pretty standard, aside from one thing. Molly's cravings for Chinese food was obscene. At first, she would go through multiple cup of noodles a day, or she would cook all of our white rice and douse it in soy sauce, which wasn't that bad. It was even sort of cute at first to joke about. After weeks of this, the only thing I could get her to eat was her special order from that same restaurant. It was almost like an addiction, but anyone who's had a pregnant partner in the past will tell you that you never want to be on their bad side. I was having to make daily trips after work to the damn place, and the smell of sriracha had just begun to make me gag. And she was about 24 weeks into the pregnancy when I went to pick up her latest orange chicken fix. I found that the place had been shut down and boarded up with tape covering the perimeter. It seemed a little much for a potential health code violation, but it made me worried about the oriental chicken crazed monster that was sleeping next to me at night. I knew this news would upset her greatly, so I drove to a different restaurant and got the same meal for her just in case she was still hungry. When I got home, I broke the news to her, but then offered the takeout box as a substitute. I expected her to be a little bummed, but nothing could have prepared me for her reaction. She grabbed the box and opened it frantically near the kitchen counter. She didn't even get silverware, she just dove into the food with her bare hand. She scooped the warm food into her mouth in a primal way before suddenly halting. She frowned and threw the whole box against the wall, screeching like a banshee that it wasn't the same. I was dumbfounded for a few minutes, unsure of what to do until she stormed off to our bedroom and slammed the door behind her. I convinced myself that her hormones must be the culprit behind her aggressive behavior and proceeded to clean up the mess she left behind. The next few days, I dreaded coming home from work. The woman I married was barely recognizable in comparison to the swollen-bellied maniac that took her place, and she refused to eat anything except for her special order. but there's no way I could get it to her. She went 4 full days without so much as a nibble, and it made her go a little nuts. The first day I came back without it, she wouldn't let me touch her anymore and would simply scream as if I were beating her without mercy. The police even showed up after a while to make sure I wasn't battering her. On the second day, she actually slapped me, but she's not very strong. Her nails did scratch me though, and I had to lie about it when my coworkers asked about its origins. The day after that, she just sat on my lap and cried. The collar of my shirt was covered in snot and drool as she wept for her beloved meal. She begged and begged, but I just couldn't make her understand that it was gone. On the 4th day, she locked me out of our room. She just slid my clothes and toothbrush under the door and then forced me onto the couch that night, the hunger pains keeping her bedridden after that. I had planned to talk to her doctor about fears of her starving when I came home again on the 5th day, ready for her howling screams of disapproval, but instead saw her in the kitchen with a big smile on her face. Just that morning, she was hacking bile into our toilet and cursing me for neglect. Now she was my sweet Molly, cooking what smelled and looked like a stew. I smiled and hugged her gently, rubbing her belly with one hand. It had felt like a lifetime since the last time I held the woman I married. I asked why she seemed so chipper now, and she said that once she ate something, she felt a lot better, and realized she didn't need her special order. I was relieved to say the least, and so was my wallet, but it was only for a short while. I wanted to believe the woman I shared a home with was back to her normal self again. Of course, I wouldn't be writing this if I had been that lucky. It was about 2 weeks later that I noticed all the missing pet posters going up around our neighborhood. The standard stuff really that I didn't pay too much attention to until my neighbor John stopped me before I went into my domicile for the rest of the day. "You know, it's dangerous to have a cat with a baby in the house. Could suffocate the poor thing," he told me, which I was seriously confused by, since we don't have a cat. I explained this to him, even admitting my allergy to their fur, but he insisted that 3 days ago my not quite back to normal wife left our home and came back with a meowing pet carrier. He asked if she needed help, but he said she ignored him and quickly went inside. I asked Molly about it, but she said our neighbor was a nosy bastard and she never brought a cat home with her. I believed her, chalking it up to a lonely old man wanting some brief company until we flipped on the news that night. We had a nice evening in home with Molly in a good mood until we saw our local news reporting in front of the restaurant she had been obsessed with. The young reporter informed our town that the repulsive restaurant had been serving cats as chicken. My wife quickly changed the channel as I gagged and remembered all the orange chicken and even the few meals I had eaten from there. This is going to sound silly, but I couldn't get the story John told me out of my head after that either. There's plenty of things we could have talked about, but why on earth would he make Molly bringing home a cat? It was painting a disturbing picture of my wife now. I had a feeling what she was up to while I was working, but I had no proof. Not until her baby shower, that is. I wasn't invited, like most husbands, so I got the house to myself for the day. I killed most of the time with video games, but my controller's batteries had died. We have a small cabinet above our stove where we keep flashlights, batteries, and other miscellaneous items. It's above my head, and I can barely see inside of without a stool, so I grabbed one to make my life easier. While I retrieved the batteries, I saw an old butter tub that I never put in there. Obviously my wife must have done it, but I wanted to know what it was there for. I took it from the cabinet, noting it made a soft jingling sound, and popped it open easily. I wish I hadn't now. What I saw staring back at me were tiny, brightly colored collars. Most were equipped with bells and even name tags. I picked one up, looking it over. It was bright green, white polka dots, silver bell, and a name tag. I didn't read it though. I was more focused on reddish-brown smudges that covered the inside of the bowl and tiny braided collars. I thought I was going to have an anxiety attack until I heard the front door open. I quickly put the collars away and took the batteries I needed before playing the dutiful husband and helping get all the new items from our car for the baby room. She's 36 weeks along in her pregnancy now, and I still haven't confronted her about finding the collars. I want to wait until after the kids are born so she doesn't hurt herself to spite me. According to the previous ultrasounds, we're expecting 3 perfectly healthy babies. I know, triplets, a little crazy, right? We went from barely able to have children to having 3 miracles overnight. However, it's not as fantastic as it sounds. Turns out around the same time my wife had her last miscarriage, she ordered these organic fertility pills online, and apparently they really worked. Of course, I didn't find this out until the day we realized she was having multiple babies. Our most recent visit to the clinic revealed their sexes. 2 little boys and a precious girl. I can't wait to see them. They'll make this period in our lives worth it. I remember thinking as I gazed at the monochrome screen. I was on the precipice of tears when something my wife said caught my attention. "It's like we're having a whole litter," she said with a toothy grin stretched across her face. That unsettled me, especially the way she looked at the screen with her wide eyes. I don't want to believe my wife would eat our children, but it happens in nature all the time if you think about it. I had a pet hamster as a kid that ate all of her babies. It freaked the hell out of me then. The more I look at how my wife gazes at her swollen belly, the hungrier her eyes seem to me. I think once the children are able to leave the hospital, I'm going to take them and divorce my wife. However, if she resists, I'll have to put down the feral mother to protect her litter. My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was a sure ticket into a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me just as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars resources towards another author. So of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, it seemed the perfect opportunity for a comeback. I poured myself another glass of whiskey by the light of my computer monitor. My ice cube had melted 3 glasses back, but no matter. I couldn't slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory. That was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes. Even better was the fact that he'd killed families instead of single people. That was yet another angle I could exploit. I clicked on a news clip from the night he'd been arrested. The best part of this case was the fact that the lunatic had turned himself in. I drained the rest of my glass, already planning what I write about that. Family serial killer with a conscience? I made a list of names to contact the next day. The police raid on the killer's apartment had been highly publicized, so I knew exactly where he lived. I looked up the landlord who owned the apartment complex and wrote his number down on a little notebook I carry around with me. A few well-placed lies might get me a tour of the killer's private quarters. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and nausea. But I didn't let that slow me down. I rolled over, took a shower, and went out to meet with the landlord of the apartment. He was a tall, portly man in his late 40s. He seemed friendly and more than a little stupid. He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone. I guess first the police and then the movers. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen, then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawl spaces from my research, and was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fit into the wall. Seems like a great place, just the kind of thing I've been looking for, I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats that were growing on my forehead. You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here? The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. Be my guest. I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, "I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished." I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. "I'm gonna be honest with you," I said. "How's that?" he asked, confused. "I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist," I said. I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant." The landlord's face clouded over with anger. "So this was a waste of my time then? I was wondering if you had any information about not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again." I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better and far worse than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate, and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading one account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank. When he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse, I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed with alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind, but I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again! I laughed out loud into the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drop before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon feeling woozy. I felt something worse than a hangover. Must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me, reading those horrible things I'd read? No, of course, no one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease this horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eyes as I passed. It was different, somehow thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside of the leather-bound notebook. I opened it up and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in a different handwriting from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. I read, in similar meticulous detail, how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband and that I had taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half hour away, and there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing continued to quicken as I stared at the house. The descriptions from the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't necessarily my handwriting, but there's no doubt it was different from the other entries, and it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911, what's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir, what do you... I cut her off, instead passing the address. Did you get that? I asked. She said. I read the address again, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened up and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt down and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with a layer of blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth. When no monster leapt from the darkness, I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged. Please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front page news. I was already in an alcohol-fueled haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere after all. Wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour looking through my house for places where I may have stashed her body, but came up short. A strange, bizarre revulsion to the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up, I wouldn't have had that axe in my garage, nor a conscience so weighted down by... No, that wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook, but rejected the idea. No. Something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already killed enough people for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the windows on the ground floor was unlocked, which allowed me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around at the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He'd had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was the damn notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely I hadn't killed this woman, then driven to the house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed up the stairs. The bedroom door opened and the light flicked on. The landlord I'd met the other day stood in the doorway holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on. Am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe towards me. "Am I right?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. "There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. Sorry, liar. You just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think?" He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X, and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact, but that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I'd hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook, but I still own the original. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I still occasionally check the ending to make sure no new entries have shown up.
Growing up with a sleepwalker in the family gets old pretty fast. At first, everyone is a bit concerned that they'll hurt themselves or wander out of the house. These fears aren't unwarranted. The sleepwalker isn't aware of their actions, and everyone else is usually, well, asleep. We only discovered my little brother was an apparent sleepwalker when we kept waking up to all of the doors and windows open in the morning. Since we live in a rural area, this wasn't too much of a danger beyond potential wild animals roaming in. Still, as the older sibling, my parents designated me as the official keeper of my brother's actions. We shared a room, you see, and they wanted to use that to my advantage when it came to retrieving and sending my brother back to bed. The common saying of "don't wake a sleepwalker" isn't as big a deal as you think. As long as you wake them gently and they're aware of their condition, they're not going to hurt themselves or be startled. Why would they be? They've just woken up after all. First, we tried bells on the door. When that failed to wake me up, my parents tried leaving plastic sheets on the floor. We tried just about everything you could possibly think of to try and alert me when he got up, and that was when my father came up with the idea of a string. Every night, my brother and I would tie a long string to our wrists and go to sleep like that. If he got up at any point, the tugging of him exiting the room woke me up pretty quickly. It was a harmless, noiseless, flawless plan that had me bringing my brother to bed long before he opened our home to the elements and animals outside. You get used to it. The string, the tugging, retrieving the sleepwalker, and putting them back to bed. Some nights he would get up more than once, and others he wouldn't sleepwalk at all. Either way, that was the only variance in an otherwise rigid routine we had. There was no spooky words out of his mouth during his sleep, no strange place he kept going back to, and no motive behind opening the doors and windows. When asked, my brother simply stated that his dream was unrelated and he didn't know why he would open the home. This went on for the better part of a year before finally dying down. We gradually stopped tying the strings to our arms before sleep because my brother stopped getting up. One night in late July, I remembered going to bed a bit earlier than usual after we took a trip down to the river for the day. Naturally, I was exhausted from an afternoon of paddling against the current and running around the nearby park with other kids my age. At some point during the night, I woke up, having become a very light sleeper thanks to my duty as watchful eye over my brother in the last year. I remembered feeling hot and sticky thanks to the humid weather, getting up and opening the window, flipping the fan on, and hoping that some air circulation might help. But when I turned to go back to bed, I saw my door was cracked open about 2 inches wide. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized there was something else as well, a face. Just beyond the threshold of the door, a small, pale face was pressed up to the crack, one big brown eye staring in at me lazily. My fear turned to frustration in an instant when I realized I was looking at my brother, who was standing completely still outside the door and more than likely sleepwalking again. With a deep breath, I gathered myself and grabbed the door handle. Go back to bed, Jesus Christ. Can't you just be normal for one night? And then I slammed the door shut and returned to bed. It was mean, but I was getting tired of it, you know? After a long day, I just wanted to sleep, and if he was just going to stand out there all night, then it wasn't my problem. The next morning was nothing special. Mom made breakfast, and as we sat down at the table, I noticed my brother wasn't up yet. That was weird. He was always an early riser and eager to greet the day. I'm guessing Joe is sleeping in today? I asked, idly picking and stabbing at my waffles. My dad set down his coffee and looked up from his paper, his brow crinkled in confusion. Joe went to stay at Andy's house last night, he said. Then slowly his face softened and he chuckled. You went to bed early, so you couldn't know. Suddenly, I wasn't very hungry. My stomach flipped and my throat felt tight. When did he go? Shortly after you went to bed, when we got back. I didn't tell my parents what I saw, worried that maybe something was now wrong with me. Instead, when my little brother came home later that day, I elected to reinstate the string system just as a precaution. Joe seemed confused, but was compliant, joking about how we're tied together forever. It was a strange comfort in a way. The string was reliable, predictable. And that was it. For the next few months, Joe and I both slept soundly with few sleepwalking incidents. I was thinking about dismissing the string again, but decided that just one more night wouldn't hurt either of us just to make sure he wasn't getting up and wandering off. And it had become a source of a handful of inside jokes for us, sibling bonding time, that kind of stuff. I think we both almost slept better when it was on as well. I woke up to a harsh tug on my arm quite suddenly. It was pitch black besides my alarm clock nearby, which read the time at 2:25 a.m. That wasn't the usual time Joe got up if he did sleepwalk, but variations could happen, and with a sigh, I began to throw my covers off and slide out of the bed. That was when the second hard yank on the string nearly sent me tumbling to the floor, and I found my anger welling up pretty quickly. I thought he must have gotten the stupid string caught on something and was trying to pry himself loose, so I collected myself and hurried towards the door that was already open. That was when I noticed something was wrong. The string was only long enough to keep us maybe 5 feet apart at the most, but this string was longer and pulled taut down the hallway and around the corner. "Joe?" I called quietly. This didn't feel right at all, but I made my way down the hall and turned the corner just in time for a third tug on the string. It was leading into the kitchen, which featured a door to the basement that was now wide open as well. The string was descending into it and the tugging beyond it was growing more intense. Impatient. This wasn't like Joe at all. He'd never gone in the basement before, let alone manually pull on the string. "Joe, are you awake? This isn't funny." I was louder this time, inching towards the open door as the string began to frantically vibrate and yank, and as if it was urging me further. The closer I got, the more excited it grew, and when I reached the doorway, the next tug was so harsh that I almost lost my balance again. Then there was a lull in the tugging when I heard a door opening behind me, the bathroom across the hall from my room. A bleary-eyed Joe stepped out and blinked, one hand rubbing his eye as he yawned. There was no string on his wrist. Suddenly, the string began to pull with a force stronger than before, making me stagger out onto the first step leading into the basement with a yell. Joe seemed to realize that I had the string on my wrist, and he didn't, and that whomever or whatever was in the basement was not him. There was a roar of noise, a low moaning from the darkness of the basement, and my little brother's frantic footfalls behind me as he ran his way over and grabbed my free arm to hold me while he scrambled for something to cut the string. I heard the kitchen drawers crashing open as he searched, and then he produced a knife, one shaky hand sawing at the string as the noise in the basement became so loud it seemed to reverberate through our bones. And then the tugging stopped. The string snapped away, and both Joe and I fell backwards onto our asses, sprawling over the kitchen floor. The noise ceased when the string was cut, and the basement door wobbled violently before slamming shut in our faces. Going to sleep after that was impossible, so Joe and I huddled up on my bed and sat with every possible light on in our room until the sun rose and our parents got up. Naturally, they didn't believe us, saying they hadn't heard a thing and slept soundly. They said that we must have hallucinated together or been sleepwalking even. Either way, I know that whatever was in the basement was not my brother, and I've refused to tie the string to my wrist ever again.
I will never forget the day I found out I was pregnant. We had been trying for years and thought it was never going to happen, so when the second line showed up on that pregnancy test, I couldn't believe my eyes. I even made my husband run out and buy 2 more just to make sure. All 3 came out positive. Finally, this was the last piece in our puzzle we were waiting for. It was like a dream come true. We were already married and living in our dream home with a big back garden that was perfect for adventurous kids. In the middle of the garden, there was an old oak tree that they could climb. One of the first things we did was put up a tire swing on it. We knew it would be years before he would be able to use it, but with the thoughts of a little one running around, we just couldn't wait. We had to do something. My husband was like a big kid himself. He wouldn't shut up about all the adventures he was going to take him on, even though I explained to him repeatedly that it would be a few years before the baby would be able to do things like that. I just think he was happy to finally have someone to play with and forgot all about the baby stage, until Harry arrived. Don't get me wrong, he was a good husband and dad. He did a lot for me during the pregnancy. When Harry was born, I needed an emergency C-section and there were complications. It took a while to recover from it. So for the first few months after Harry came home, Dan did nearly everything for him. From night feeds to changing diapers, which must have been hard. He is one of the most impatient people I know, so it was a bit of a challenge. It took a little bit of time for us both to adjust, I suppose. There were plenty of stressful days and sleepless nights too, but when I was back on my feet, we managed to get into our own rhythm. After that, everything went smoothly for us. Well, as smooth as it can be with a new baby in the house, I mean. I think he was almost 3 months old when I first noticed something odd. I was holding him in my arms while feeding him and staring into his beautiful blue eyes as usual, when suddenly he stopped feeding and just started staring at me with this strange look in his eyes, kinda like he was angry with me. I assumed it was just gas and put him on my shoulder to burp him. What happened next, I swear to you, is true. I was rubbing his back when he moved suddenly and slipped off my shoulder. Luckily, I caught him before he fell, but unfortunately, I pinched him with my nails in the process. He didn't cry or anything, he just made a growling noise. I gave him a hug and a kiss before putting him back up on my shoulder. A few seconds later, I heard him whisper something in my ear. It sounded like cunt. I just laughed. It had to be one of his little baby noises, I thought, and continued rubbing his back. Not long after, I heard it again. Cunt. This time it was loud and clear. I put him sitting on my knee and repeated, "Did you say a bad word, cutie? Did you? Did you?" jokingly in my usual silly voice. He stared into my eyes without breaking eye contact or even blinking with a strange look I had not seen before for about 5 minutes. I thought he might still have had some gas, so I put him back up on my shoulder and started rubbing his back with my hand. He started pushing his head closer and closer to my face until he was near my ear. Then suddenly he grabbed onto one of my earrings with his mouth and started shaking his head. I tried to pull him away, but he would not let go. It was so painful, I thought he was going to rip it off my ear, but luckily I managed to open it before he got the chance. When I put him sitting back down on my knee, he spit it out and hit me on the side of the face, then smirked at me with this creepy grin. At the time, I thought it was just one big coincidence. I could never imagine he could have hurt anyone on purpose. How could I? He was only a baby. When my husband got home, I told him what had happened, and we both had a good laugh about it, but I never wore earrings around him again. The rest of that night was uneventful. It was my husband's turn to get up with him, so it was the next morning after my husband went to work before I was alone with Harry again. It was also the last day of my parental leave, so I was going to try to make the most of it and bring him to the park. He loved looking at the ducks. Before I left, I decided to change his diaper. He was not happy about it. When I tried to undress him, he kept kicking me unusually hard. I didn't know what was wrong with him. I had never seen him like that before. When I finally got him fully dressed, he gave me the finger. I know what you think, just baby stuff. Well, that's what I thought at the time. Even though he looked into my eyes while grinding his, I would say teeth, but he didn't have any. For the rest of the day, he did not look at me once, not even when I fed him. That night it was my turn to get up and feed him, but I had trouble sleeping. I think I was just stressed with the thoughts of going back to work after that long break. I was just lying there when I heard something on the baby monitor. It sounded like someone muttering to themselves. I thought maybe our lines got crossed and we were picking up someone else's monitor, but I got up and checked on him to make sure. I sneaked quietly down the hallway so not to wake him and looked in through the crack in the partially open door. I was shocked with what I saw. He was sitting up looking around. I was amazed. He was not supposed to be able to do that for another few months, so I ran up and got my phone to record him. On my way back down, he screamed and frightened me. It was so loud I thought there must have been something seriously wrong with him. When I got there, I found him lying on the floor just inside the door. He had made so much noise he woke up my husband. He found me standing over Harry and thought I had dropped him. I tried to tell him I found him like that, but he just would not believe me. When my husband put him up on his shoulder to console him, Harry smiled over at me with, I know this sounds weird to say about a baby, but with a smug look on his face. After that, things went downhill for me. It seemed like any time I was near him, there were problems. From screaming when I touched him when my husband was around to pinching, scraping, or throwing things at me when we were all alone. I'm sure my husband thought I was hurting Harry on purpose, but he didn't say it to me. But he was always looking over my shoulder any time I was near the baby. I tried my best to improve my relationship with him, but it was hard. I worked long hours, and he was usually in bed when I got home. The only time I got to spend with him was on the weekends. Even then, it might only be for a few hours, and I practically spent no time alone with him. Eventually, I felt like I had no choice but to take a step back from my responsibilities at work, which meant a demotion and a sufficient salary reduction. But at least I would get home at a reasonable hour. My husband was very supportive of my decision. He said he was just happy we would be able to spend more time together, which was nice to hear. For the first few weeks, everything couldn't have gone better. We were finally able to do things as a family. I even started to believe Harry was starting to warm up to me. He still looked like he was disgusted by me and tried to avoid eye contact, but at least he wasn't acting out when I wasn't near him anymore. Things were going good until a few weeks ago. My husband bought a new baby monitor with a camera. The other one mysteriously disappeared one night after putting Harry to bed. I really liked it. I was able to watch him sleep and got into the habit of watching the monitor every night before I fell asleep. Somehow, I think he knew, and he didn't like it. He started sitting up in his cot staring into the camera until I fell asleep. Anytime I tried to show my husband what he was doing, Harry would just fall back and pretend he was asleep before he got a chance to see him. The more I watched, the more it started to creep me out. It was like he could see me. I often dozed off. When I woke, I would see him scanning the room as if he were looking for something. Then he would quickly turn to the camera again and stare at me until I fell asleep. I always thought me and Harry's problems were caused by us not bonding properly when we came home from the hospital, and all the weird things that happened were just in my head, but I was wrong. Last night I woke to the sound of Harry laughing. When I checked the monitor, he wasn't in his cot. I tried to call my husband, but no matter what I did, he wouldn't wake up. I ran down and checked every part of his room, but he was not there. I was really beginning to worry at this stage. I was ready to call the police when I thought I heard a noise downstairs, but he wasn't there. So I ran back up in a panic to get my phone. Then I heard what sounded like mumbling. It seemed like it was coming from my room. When I opened the door, I was horrified with what I saw. Harry was sitting on my husband's chest with his hands over his mouth chanting. My husband's legs were shaking and he was struggling to breathe. I panicked and pushed Harry onto the bed and started doing CPR. The whole time, Harry laughed hysterically. For nearly 10 minutes, I did everything I could to save him, but nothing I did was working. I thought he was going to die. I was so scared. By the time the paramedics got there, he had stopped moving altogether. They got to work on him straight away and found a pacifier wedged deep in his throat. Luckily, they got it out just in time. They said if I didn't do CPR, he wouldn't have made it. Thank God he's going to be okay, but he will be kept in for a few days. The problem is now I am stuck at home with Harry, and I'm afraid of what he will do to me. In the fall of 2016, I moved into a home I got for a very reasonable price. I was newly single, so I wanted a place to myself. It had 3 bedrooms, a big bathroom, spacious kitchen, and a nice living room with a bay window. The basement was one big space with a laundry unit, so this was more than enough for me. The block was mostly abandoned houses with only 5 other families occupying the other properties. I only had one neighbor right beside my home. I wasn't a social bug at the time, so I never bothered to meet the neighbors. It seemed that my neighbor was also single and a female, slightly older than me. She was Hispanic, or at least seemed to be. On the 3rd day, she greeted me from her yard as I was taking out the trash. She said her name was Griselda and that she was house-sitting for her sister, who was in Guerrero, Mexico with her 2 nieces, for the next few months. She didn't say much after that. Over the next week, I would constantly catch her watching me as I did my normal house routines, as well as yard work. She would look from her windows as I would be cooking or cleaning. I would usually just ignore it and close my shades. I'm not one to worry much, so it didn't bother me at first. When I would come and leave for work, she would always be on her porch in her wooden chair. I started to wonder if she even had a job. She never left her house, not even for groceries or to take out her garbage. She even wore the same clothes every day. Her house lights were never on. The only light that would be on was the basement, and that was only at night. No crime was committed, so I couldn't report this, so I just kept to myself. Around the 2nd month, I became aware she was speaking what I believe was Latin on her porch as she watched me come and go for work. Strange things began to happen. Things in the house went mysteriously missing. Small random things like my comb, photos, and even an old kitchen knife. I would come home and a window would be slightly open, a light would be on, that I knew was off. The basement door would be unlocked. I would always keep it locked. Even my garbage cans would look like someone was looking through them. This began to concern me. One night I woke up to the sound of leaves rustling outside my bedroom window. I see her crouched down looking inside my basement and the light was on. I go to my porch to confront her before checking my basement. She was already on her porch. I told her to stay the fuck off my property. She gives me a dirty look, says something under her breath, and then spits in my direction. I storm inside and head for my basement. All the missing items were on the basement floor. What the fuck? I gather them and put them on the kitchen counter. I was very sleepy, so I chose to go back to sleep since I had a long work day ahead. The next night was not what I expected. As I left for work at 7 a.m., I noticed she wasn't on her porch this time. Thank goodness, she gets the point, I thought to myself. That night I woke up, I hear this woman. She's in my house. Her voice was coming from the basement. I get my baseball bat and head downstairs. Basement door is wide open and the light's on. She wasn't down there, but I found 3 rats that were gutted. Their insides were scattered around the basement. Suddenly I hear footsteps going up the stairs to the bedroom. I run up and find her naked, sitting at the foot of my bed. She had blood on her hands, arms, chest, and face. She killed those rats with her fucking teeth. She hissed at me and I slammed the door shut, locking her in. I called the police and they arrive in minutes. They informed me that her name was Ashley. They also discovered her sister and the 2 nieces in the basement of their home. Their bodies were propped on a couch. They were decomposing. A camera on a tripod was in front of them. She was taking photos with them and had a smile on each one. She stabbed them to death. The police stated that the photos went back as far as 3 months. The bodies slowly decomposing in each of them. I believe I was about to be your next victim. I still live here, but I'm more cautious about the people around me. I now know to report suspicious behavior when I see it. Stay safe, y'all.
I was always so excited to finally go to college. Now that I'm here, the story is a little different. I always dreamt of living in a dorm, meeting my new roommates, making more friends, and maybe meeting the love of my life. After night 1, all of those dreams became very short-lived. I ended up choosing a dorm where I'd only have 1 roommate, and we'd share a living space and bedroom. Pretty typical for a college dorm setup, right? Well, my bid for a roommate came in an Instagram DM from Sarah, an incoming freshman from Tucson, Arizona. She seemed nice enough. A quick swipe through her feed let me catch a glimpse at her life. She had a love for photography, all things artistic, and an undying devotion to her family dog named Buddy. Of course, I met Sarah on move-in day. After appropriately being coated in sweat from the Arizona heat and carrying my entire packable life up 4 flights of stairs, she greeted me in our dorm. Let me tell you a couple of things about Sarah. 1, she never looks bad, and I mean never. A hurricane couldn't misplace a hair on her head. 2, she's obsessed with the color pink. I've always thought our favorite colors reflect more of our personalities than we'd like to believe. So, do with that information what you will. Our parents left shortly after. We'd had our tearful goodbyes and all the mushy, make sure you call as often as you can chats. I'm not much of an extrovert, but before I knew it, Sarah was face down in her phone looking for parties and other weekend events. Come on, she crooned. Don't be fucking lame already. I decided to politely decline her surely vodka-oriented invitations and made up an excuse about unpacking. Here's where it gets weird. The first night in the dorm, I stayed up until probably 2 a.m., settling into my surroundings and decorating my side of the dorm until it didn't remind me of a jail cell. Where was Sarah, you ask? Yeah, not home. I didn't even have her phone number to text her, and I also didn't want to deal with a real shit-faced co-ed after moving all day. Fast forward to 5 a.m., I hear the door lock jiggle before it finds the path of least resistance and opens. Much to my surprise, I met with quiet shuffling as Sarah moved around the room. Even in my drowsiness, I was put on alert. I mean, who can be that quiet when they're that drunk? Naturally, I roll over to check out the scene, and when I do, I find myself nose to nose with my roommate. I threw myself back into the brick wall behind me and let out a scream of terror, yet there she stood. She never moved or flinched, just kept her place, steadily breathing with a menacing smile. She remained in her statuesque pose for about 5 minutes while my adrenaline wore off. However, she kept smiling. She smiled until drool lined the corners of her mouth, then streamed past its barrier and dropped onto my comforter. I didn't know what the fuck kind of sleepwalking this was, but I was not a fan. After choking down my own fear, I calmly reached for her, placing my hands on each of her arms. After a few head-jolting shakes, she snapped back into reality. She never mentioned what had just happened, but instead ran her bare wrist across her lips to collect the remaining spittle and shot me a quick goodnight before piling into her twin XL. I could have written this incident as a one-off, but it's been happening every night since. I've told my RA. I've talked to Sarah about it during daylight hours. I've consulted my friends and parents, but they all chalk it up to sleepwalking. I know everyone has their own differences in sleepwalking tendencies, but it's not just the smiling. The other night, I woke up to her crouched over our bathroom sink, looking into the mirror. If she'd been silent, I probably could have continued my REM cycle. She was talking to someone, not herself, but someone. I caught just enough of the conversation to hear her asking them when they wanted her home and how she was almost done with her list. She heard me after I rolled over a little too fast, causing the springs under me to creak unforgivingly. Immediately afterwards, her focus snapped towards me. It was pitch black, but I could still tell her neck pivoted in a way which is not humanly possible. Then, bones creaking as she pried herself away from the mirror, she shuffled towards me once again, mouth watering as she bore her teeth in that god-awful smile. She lowered herself closer, settling when we were once again nose to nose. "Your last," she hissed, panting on my face. I don't need to know what the list is for her to understand her, but I don't want to find out for the specifics. She just climbed into bed like she was calling it an early night after she said it too. I've dealt with this all year, and the semester is almost over. I really want to at least survive my freshman year.